Hi, my name's Dee Harding. I'm an artist that's currently based in Brisbane in Queensland, and I've made this work behind us for the Sydney Biennale. Over the last few years, particularly around some academic research which I had completed, the focus of my work has largely been around looking for ways to do more of what already exists in Aboriginal families in central Queensland. So typically my work is engaging with what I inherit via both my mother's parents, my grandparents, and also looking for ways that through contemporary art making, perhaps other Aboriginal people in central Queensland might say, hey, that reflects some of what we do. I can see myself in that perhaps, or that's something that I'm familiar with. I have a saying which I'm using a bit more often lately, which is that nerds rock, and I really believe that nerds rock, and particularly art nerds. So I have a very strong interest in global art histories, as well as what my family inherits, and as well as the art forms and the cultural practice that we bring forward into 2022 from ancestral forms in central Queensland. I also have an enduring love and passion for global art practices. And some of those overlap in the work that I make at times. And particularly it's occurred in this work here, drawing upon what might be familiar to my family, but also drawing upon practices or ways of making an artwork that we could talk about via practices from the 1960s onwards, really, around action and movement and performance. After receiving an invitation from the curator Hannah Donnelly and Jose Roca to be involved in this iteration of the Sydney Biennale, it was easy to look towards some of the work that had already been occurring in my practice. And there was another idea which I had around how can we get access and improve the relation that Aboriginal families, particularly at Woorabinda, a community that my grandmother has a responsibility for, that we inherit that now that she's finished up. But how can we get Aboriginal families back into regular and familiar contact with their own waterways? And so there's a social element to this work which sees that via my uncles and one of my grandfathers in Woorabinda, on Gungaloo country, there's an element of the community finding their way back to a stronger familiarity and negotiating those barriers and the challenges or the things that have not made it easy for the local community to have access to the Mimosa Creek, which runs through town and can provide water to the town, but is typically dry these days. So in looking at environmental concerns, in looking at Indigenous knowledges, in looking at waterways and the importance of prioritising waterways and ecosystems based in and around water systems, the work was developed in conjunction very strongly with my mum's brother Milton Lawton and his uncle Stephen Kemp in Woorabinda around the Mimosa Creek. And so also looking at ecological questions or ethical questions around resource use. I've made a deliberate effort in recent years to see how the work can have the lowest impact in terms of the drawing and the use of resources. So the reality is the majority of the resources for this exhibition, on my part for the work, are actually being enacted and lived by the community in Woorabinda in their time spent preparing for and eventually walking the Mimosa Creek together as a community and reporting back that to each other. So the work also here is made from cardboard and water and gum arabic only. Potentially all of those things that could either be ingested or very readily composted at the end of the exhibition, if they don't live onwards. Exhibition spaces, and particularly contemporary art exhibition spaces, are places of sharing, and it has been my experience that they're places of genuine dialogue. So there have been safe places for me in dialogue, but it's also a really good place to be able to assert that, particularly for Aboriginal families and communities, that dialogue is not always safe or welcome. That in fact asking questions and asking for more is not always safe and is not always welcome. So my experience in central Queensland, particularly around my grandparents' estates, is that what is asked of families and what is asked of communities is at times imbalanced, and what we can do via exhibition practice and via the conversations we generate in these spaces is to reassert and also help to assure Aboriginal families that you don't have to be performing and you don't have to ask for permission for your own inheritance to be given validity and for your own inheritance to be lived in your daily life. So exhibition practice gives us a chance to be showing and sharing, and gives us a chance to be educating and elucidating some of our interests and our concerns. But in terms of cultural practice, it belongs at the kitchen table in my perspective, and it belongs in the dining room, and it belongs in the car of the families who inherit those places. So my priority is to see that there's more of that, and that Aboriginal families, via visibility and recognition through exhibition practice like this, have a clear sense that what is theirs is important. We shouldn't be asking much more. I've travelled thousands of kilometres through central Queensland highways in recent years, and often there is a fence line on either side of the highway that I'm driving on. Whether my grandparents have an inheritance to those estates and those territories and those lands and waterways is put in question at times by those barbed wire fences which are put there. So for me, some of the motivation behind this work is to see that those barbed wire fences can be questioned. They can be questioned in ways which asks, how can we step over those to carry on the things that we have a responsibility for, and to have access to the places that we are nourished by, and to have access to the places that are holding our ancestors and also our knowledge systems in ways which are constructive and healthy. So those waterways belong to everyone who's living on those territories. And many of the times, the Aboriginal families who are upholding their knowledge systems on those territories are the ones that are doing the work to see that those waterways are cared for and those waterways are nourished. It's an opportunity through conversations like this that the greater Australian public might recognise that there are deeper and more complex considerations around water resources and around water places, not just a resource to be taken from or to be extracted from, but places of water, and particularly permanent water in dry landscape, that perhaps the Australian general population might get a greater idea that not all water is for swimming in, not all water is a theme park, and that not all water is used for pouring onto mass broadacre agriculture or to be washing down coal.